Hey everyone, I just got some new equipment tonight, so I'm going to try making a new video on how I do my rust technique. So let's hop in. First I start with my corroded metal by using Sterling Battlemire. I thin it down with a little bit of water first. Oops, here we go. Where are you? Sorry, I'm just getting used to the camera angles. So I pre-mix my pots, usually. In this case, I thinned this one down with a little bit of water. And you can also do it as you go. So if you start applying it, you can always just wet your brush after and kind of move it around a little bit. Depends on how you feel. So anyways, we're going to do this section here tonight. I'll do it start to finish with the corroded metal, and then I will show everybody how I do my rust after that. So let's get a closer look at my brush here. Where are you? So I use a pretty large stipple brush. It's not in great shape. I beat it up a lot because I do a lot of this sort of stuff. But basically, I kind of stab at it, I guess, in an up and down motion. I think the area we're going to cover tonight is about a 6" by 6" square. When you're doing the Battlemire texture stippling, don't use a good brush because the microbeads or whatever's in it, it really kind of clogs up the inside of the brush, and it's something you don't want to be doing with a good brush. Obviously, get cheap brushes from the store. A lot of my brushes, actually, I don't really use a lot of good quality brushes for my terrain. I do use, however, the large wash brush from Games Workshop. Again, you don't have to. We'll work on this spot here. You get a better view from here. So yeah, I'm just going up and down with it. One more square left. Now, because I am a father with a little toddler running around, I try to make every second count that I have for painting. So, I use a hairdryer, which I stole from my lovely girlfriend. And I speed up the process so that way I can kind of keep going. I don't want to let this dry overnight. I'd never get anything done. So I'm going to just turn the volume off, and then I'm going to blow this dry real quick, and then we'll start with the next step. Okay, so that's all dry now. I rinsed out the stipple brush as well, just so I can just get it prepped for my following steps here. Now, from here, I'm going to base coat the whole area in Games Workshop Citadel Warp Lock Bronze. Now this one is quite wet and diluted, again just because it kind of, I wanted to cover more surface area. So here we go, and I'm using a different brush this time. It's just, again, a beat up brush I use for base coating terrain. Just coat the whole area. The thing with stippling, which is why I like it so much, is it gives a texture naturally. That's for any of you guys that follow me on Instagram. I do a lot of stippling even with my skin on my war pigs that I've done. I keep my paints really thin, and I stipple the skin with a really, really fine, well, it's a beat up fine detail brush. But it has the effect of, again, when using a hairdryer and drying the layers really quickly, it leaves kind of a rippled effect on the skin, and it kind of makes the skin, again, kind of chunky, a little bit more textured, more lifelike, rather than flat, smooth. Again, skin isn't naturally smooth like that, unless you're a baby, I guess. But I find it has texture, especially my beat up hands working in concrete. And yeah, same thing goes for terrain. Stipple, stipple, stipple. Again, you don't really have to stipple this if you don't want to. You can brush this on. It makes no difference. I stipple too because I don't necessarily I don't want to break off the texture from the Sterling Battlemire. I just worry sometimes if you were to brush it off, maybe like a little too rough with the brush, it might brush it off. So I stipple it. I've never had my terrain in any pieces kind of flake away in that sense. Everything that I've done has lasted this far, so I'm not worried about that. Okay, looks good. Base coated. Okay. Again, with the hairdryer that you could steal from your girlfriend, or maybe you have one of your own. Volume off, and here we go. Alright, now that that's dry, we can hit our next step, and that is to stipple on Citadel Leadbelcher. Again, you don't necessarily have to use Citadel paints. The key I find is starting with a dark metallic, like that, the dark bronze color, and then working your way up to, again, a darker metal, like the Leadbelcher. You don't have to, if you've got your own particular brand that you like using, again, by all means, go with that. This is more of a guide on the kind of the rough colors that I use. So just kind of, anyways, I put a little bit of lead belcher on my brush, okay, and I just, again, I try to work it into the bristles on my palette. I don't want a whole lot on the brush itself. You can also just grab a piece of paper too and just do a test piece, a test sample before you start going. As you can kind of see here, a little piece of junk mail. Right, you can kind of practice on a little piece of paper and see if you like the texture that you're getting before you apply to the terrain or the model that you're doing. Okay. It's hard to paint with this thing. Yeah, I'm just learning positioning with this camera here. I bumped it on the last one. Okay. A little bit more paint. There's still quite a few more steps involved, so I mean, if you end up adding too much of one color, or if you find you've made it too bright, don't worry, because we're gonna add black washes, you know, a little bit of agrax, things like that, just to kind of bring the colors back down. But this just gives you that kind of a base color for that nice worn look. As you can see, I'm kind of just, again, coming down on the terrain, stabbing the model almost, or the terrain piece with my brush. Okay, that looks good. Now, from here, I'm not going to need to use the blow dryer because it's already quite dry. I'm not adding a lot of wet paint like this. When I'm stippling this stuff on, I don't use thin down paint. I go right from the pot, and then I don't wash my brush. I want this brush to stay as dry as possible. Okay. So from here, I use brass scorpion. And then I, again, kind of same idea. Get a little bit on your brush. There you go. Okay. And then you're going to kind of just work that into the bristles in your palette in a circular motion. Okay. Get your piece of paper, again, and kind of, or a paper towel, whatever you want, and try to get the excess off as much as you can. Right. Okay, now we can start again. With this one, I'm going to stipple a little bit less, and not quite as hard. I'm going to go a little lighter. I go quite hard with the first coat, the lead belcher, right? But I'm going to go a little lighter pressure with this, and you don't necessarily have to cover the same area. Like, you can leave spots out. It's supposed to be random. So with that little bit of material that I put on my brush, and then wiping most of it off, I was able to cover this whole 6x6 area. Okay. So that's that. Now again, I'm not going to wash my brush. I've got to do one more step of stippling. So I'm going to just put that aside. It's not going to dry out. Again, it's a cheap brush. You know, if it gets a little bit wrecked, it's for stippling, and to be honest, it just probably adds to the effect anyways. So I'm not really too upset about it. Okay, so from here, I do a mix of Game Color Smoky Ink and Nuln Oil. Okay, so I do about a 50-50 mix. Now again, something like this, I usually just pre-mix it a little bit in a spare container. This one isn't labeled, but I'm using it pretty much for this table, so I kind of get a feel for which can of paint is which. Anyways, yeah, so I pre-mix my things for this sort of stuff. Just saves time. That way, you know, you've got a large batch already made up. That way you don't have to fart around mixing it up in a palette every 15 minutes. I do the same thing for my skin tones, like my washes and things like that. Same thing for my Death Guard, my armor, and things. I found it useful to pre-mix certain washes. You know, like a 50-50 of Agrax Earthshade and Athonian Camo Shade, for example. I like to use that a lot in my my cream-colored armors. So, like Death Guard, for example. Again, I'm doing a heavy wash. Just kind of slapping it in. And then once we're done this, we're going to use the hairdryer once more. Oops, change angles here. And that way we can speed it up. Now, myself, I've been kind of doing this, I've been working on my Nurgle Maggotkin for quite some time, and I always hated the Games Workshop green armors and things like that with Nurgle. I just never liked it. I wanted that beat up, worn metal look, and it's just been a technique that I've been kind of working on over the past few years with my Nurgle, and then when I got into the grim dark side of 40K, I kind of began experimenting a little bit further with it, and that's kind of where I am now. Again, I see a lot of this sort of stuff in the workplace. I took a couple of photos today of some completely rusted flashings and things like that. Scaffolding ladders I see, you know, that are just completely pitted, and it's just, there's a lot of interesting source material in my line of work. Oh no, I just hit the camera. No. Okay, I'm going to pause it for a sec. Anyways, so I'm done. I'm going to blow dry it, and then I'm going to fix the camera. Alright, so camera's fixed. The wash is dry. From here, I'm going to do one final really light stipple of lead belcher again. Okay. Just a little bit on the brush. Dab it off. And again, I'm not going everywhere. I'm just hitting it and kind of select random spots. The pressure I used on this one was quite a bit harder than I did with the brass scorpion, only because the brass scorpion is easy to overdo, I find. So yeah. That looks good. So I'm done with stippling now. So that is going to go back into the wash pot, paint pot, whatever. Whoops. Okay, from here I'm going to do a heavy wash with Nuln Oil. I made the mistake last weekend when I bought some paints. I bought the gloss, and I didn't realize it, but it was a little late, and anyways, I did a section with it, and yeah, it was a bit glossier, but it wasn't an awful effect. So I'm using the Games Workshop wash brush now, the big one. Okay. And instead of stippling this on, I'm loading it up quite heavily. And then I'm just giving it a wash. Okay, so you can see that big spot in the back there that I've done. Again, you can kind of just drag that towards the other areas that need it. It's okay if this pools. It's not the end of the world. Again, it just adds to the effect, I find. It doesn't have to be uniform and consistent, because metal isn't uniform and consistent when it's corroded and rusty, and nothing's the same. The benefit of rust and corroded material, it's got so many different colors to it. So many different colors of orange, reds, browns, you name it. And same thing with this. I mean, this I'd be happy with by itself. I'd probably, in the end, if I was to play to just leave a corroded surface like this, I would probably give it, after this step, probably maybe a really light dry brush around the edges, or even a little bit of stippling, just to bring a little bit of spot color back. But again, it would have to be really light. Okay. Now, that's it. We're going to dry this. And that's how I do my corroded metal. For anybody that's curious. Now once this is dry, we take it that next step further, and then we start doing pigments. So I'm going to pause the camera, bust out the hairdryer, and then we'll be back with some pigments, and I'll go over what I use for those. Alright, we're back. Everything's dry. Doesn't take long. It takes only like a couple minutes. I put the hairdryer on the hotter temperature. Yeah, and I just try to dry it as fast as I can. Now I'm going to just move the camera just to see what this looks like from top down for you guys to see. Let's see if I can get a good angle here. Something close. I'll try to zoom in. so I don't think the light is really helping completely tonight, but I assure you, it looks really good. Let's try that. That's a bit better. Alright. Okay, so back to pigments. Let's see, is that okay? Okay. Alright, so I use, for all my pigments, I've been using this Tamiya lacquer thinner. That doesn't look right. I'm going to pause this and fix the camera. Sorry. Alright, sorry about that. Okay, so yeah, I use a lacquer thinner, Vallejo. Get in the picture. Now, this stuff is 14 bucks Canadian from my local hobby store. Again, I'm going through quite a bit of it. So I went to a local do-it-yourself store and I picked up a giant bottle of this stuff, almost a liter for I think 10 bucks. So it just seemed a bit more cost effective that way. Now the stuff does stink pretty significantly. I've had good results as well with dollar store rubbing alcohol. Get in the picture, you. Stupid. Anyways, it's a 70%. It's not getting in the picture here, but it's a 70% rubbing alcohol for first aid kits and things like that, or whatever people use it for. Yeah, 70%. That stuff has been working fine for me. I do find though that handling the material, like handling like a model that has had the rust treatment, I find with the rubbing alcohol, it flakes off a little bit easier. With the lacquer thinner, I find it's really set in place and it doesn't want to come off. So that's the bonus. The lacquer thinner though stinks quite a bit more. The rubbing alcohol not so much. What you could always do with the rubbing alcohol is probably use a pigment fixer. I don't use those. I've heard many things about them. Yeah, I've never had an issue with lacquer thinner. I've heard good advice though from a gentleman at one of my local stores, and he basically said, you know what, if a little bit rubs off, you just add a little bit more back in the future. That's just kind of the beauty of weathering, you know. So hey, I don't really mind. So we're gonna start. Sorry for rambling. I start with a dark red ochre from Vallejo. Again, if you guys are using any particular brand, this is all I've ever used. This is all that is available at my local stores. So they are unfortunately going out of business. They're selling the store or whatever it is. So I may have to try to find alternatives at some point. I do hear AK Interactive is very good. I've seen a few things online, and yeah, I'm pretty excited at some point. Once my stock runs out, I'll probably have to bite the bullet and try to order those online. Okay, so I've put a little bit of powder into my palette. Okay, now I'm going to mix this off camera because I just don't want it spilling onto the table. So with the rubbing alcohol or the lacquer thinner, if it comes in a bigger jug, I tend to transfer it into something a little bit easier to pour. Okay, so it's back. Okay, so that's kind of the consistency. It's almost like a glaze. It's quite thin. It's not quite watery yet. I don't know if you can see how it looks when I bring it up onto the palette. Okay, but that's the consistency I usually go for. Just careful not to spill it everywhere. Okay, and here. Oh crap. This is hard to do with the camera. Okay, so I'm going to start on the middle one. I kind of just do a perimeter. And then some kind of just random patterns. That's it. So some spots look heavy, some spots look a little light. That's all good. That's rust. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and do the rest of them. Now the nice thing with pigments is if your medium evaporates, like your lacquer thinner or your alcohol or whatever, and your material starts becoming a bit more thick, and you don't want it to be that thick, you can always add more of your thinner, and it'll bring it back to life. And that's why I basically have a palette that I do for my terrain, and it's got, you know, the three kind of metals that I use religiously. So that's where I kind of rub the brushes out a little bit, and then it's got 3 spots for my pigments. As you can see, the pigment, I think it's getting a little bit thicker as I'm talking. Okay, so we're going to just add a little bit more material. Okay, I'm going to add a little bit more . Yeah, and this stuff does smell. I don't wear a mask with vapor filters. I do for work. But this stuff is pretty smelly. I would recommend opening windows, having a fan on. Not doing it in front of your girlfriend's face. But hey, we put up with nail polish and things like that too, right guys? Okay, so one more square to do, and then I'm going to hit this up with the hairdryer. Okay, I guess you could also do a little bit in these little vents here too. I'm going to do a little bit of those. Nothing special, just again, just kind of random brush strokes. I'm holding my my paintbrush up quite high, and then I kind of just wiggle my wrist around a little bit in just random patterns, and that gives me kind of the random effect I'm looking for. I've got a little bit left on my palette. What I might do is just again kind of go back to that middle square where we started, and I'm just going to darken a few spots up. Okay, because it's so fluid, if you just dab it at a spot, it'll want to just kind of flow, right? So if I just hit a spot, it just kind of wants to flow. Almost done for the first step. Okay, so that's the first one done. Gonna rinse my brush and get the hairdryer out, and then we'll be back. Alright, we're back. As you can see, the pigment has begun to kind of has that dusty look to it. Now we start with Vallejo Pigments Old Rust. Let's see if it focuses. Old Rust. Okay, so I've put a little bit in my palette again. Okay. Mix it up. And away we go. There's a lot of different rust pigments. Now, I have experimented with a few of the Vallejo stuff, and I really like the first kind of the three that I use in my videos. I did buy another rust at one point, and it's so bright. I almost don't like it. Yeah, anyways. So that one hardly gets used. Anyways, again, kind of same idea. I've mixed my material in my palette, and from here you can kind of just dab spots. Okay? You're not looking, you don't have to. I did in my first video, I think I coated the whole thing. And again, it depends on what you're looking for. You can do whatever you want, really. Half the fun is just experimenting with it, right? But it's just nice to get that little color variation. Yeah, and the nice thing about using the alcohol or the lacquer thinner is when you apply this over your over a previous color, it kind of blends into it. It's kind of neat. So anyways, just have fun playing around with it. I know I do. Like I said, I'm basically self-taught on a lot of this stuff. I just did a lot of trial and error. A lot of my early Death Guard models, if anybody followed me on my early days on my Instagram, I had a pretty awful technique where I basically did the same for my my corroded metal, and then what I did was I washed the whole or just whatever area I wanted covered in pigment with the Vallejo rust wash. They've got a couple of dark washes and a light wash. Anyway, so what I did was I applied the wash to the weapon or the bit of armor, and then I literally loaded up a dry brush of pigment and I flicked it onto the wet surface, and I just let it dry. And it actually was a cool effect. It dried kind of chunky, which is kind of fun. So that's what I mean. You play around, you find kind of different techniques that you like, that work for you. You find whatever works for you. But yeah, this is the way that I've been kind of doing my rust lately. I'm much more happy with it. It's much more natural, I find. So I'm hitting little bits of perimeter. Some spots where I hit the dark red ochre, right? Move my palette down. And then as the material dries up, you can always go back and add more. You know, hey, I want a little bit more color here. It's too dark, it's not bright enough, it's not what I'm looking for, whatever, just go back and apply a little bit more. Again, there's really no rule here. You just have to kind of practice. I'm not really using any special brush strokes or anything. I'm kind of mixing the brush in my palette as I go. It kind of keeps the pigment fresh and active as I go. So every time I dip my brush into that palette, I'm stirring it up a little bit. I'm mixing it in a little bit more at a time. Like I said, I keep my palette here, so if I have way too much in my palette and I'm just like, you know what, I'm not going to use that tonight, I'll just let it sit. It'll turn into a powder, shortly, and I'll just make sure I don't bump it. So I have powder everywhere. Okay. And again, if you make it kind of thin, like the thinner you make it, it kind of just becomes a little bit translucent and gives off a good effect too. But I have experienced where if you make your mix too thin, especially with the lacquer thinner, it can eat away at the paint. Now, I'm not sealing anything in between coats. You've obviously seen that. I haven't sealed anything. I've never had like a really bad issue with it. There was one time where I was experimenting on one of my Ganger's bolt guns, and I used lacquer thinner. Now I made a mistake, so I used straight lacquer thinner in hopes to kind of rub the pigment away, and I obviously stripped all the nice paint off. So don't do that. Okay. As you can see, and I'm just getting a little bit on my brush at this point here, and I'm just kind of doing random swirls. Bob Ross would be so proud. Happy little swirls. Okay, and I'm going to do a little bit in the venting. Oops. Casting a shadow. Okay, so that's done. I got a little bit of pigment left in my tray. I'm gonna just leave it alone. I don't want to use it. I'm gonna hit this with a dryer again, and then we'll do the next step. All right, so that layer is dry. Now, I've thrown this into my palette next. Just Vallejo pigment rust. Sorry. Okay. It's the lightest color that I like using as a final kind of touch. Now I'm going to just mix a little bit of lacquer thinner into the palette. Again, I kind of make a wet mix. Now, I load my brush, and I get my brush and I blow it onto the surface. You could probably use an air compressor dialed down, maybe, but this is just something I do for like a splash effect. Vallejo makes a lot of good weathering products. They've got, splash mud, industrial splash, stuff like that. It's a bit of a thicker material, but I do the same thing for my terrain. I'll load a brush, and it gives it just that extra little bit of texture and material. It looks like just stuff was splashing up against it, like an acid rain or something like that. I was actually cupstoning concrete today. It's basically you have a grinder with a diamond blade disc, and we have to make sure everything's dustless over here. But if that doesn't work, you have to use water. So just imagine just concrete slurry all over the walls and things like that. So I did take a photo of it today, just as a reference for industrial splash. You can even just get your brush and just kind of flick it too. It's all good. Again, it's just about trying new things, having fun with it. This is the most rewarding part for me, is weathering. It's probably the most fun I have with painting. But yeah, so that's that. I'm going to hit this up real quick with a hairdryer, and then we're going to go on to our final step. Alright, we're back. So my final step is a really light dry brush with lead belcher. Now I am quite hard with this dry brush. I don't want to have a lot on my brush. So again, I kind of just rub it in circular motions. Okay, and then I'm going to rub some off on the paper. Now, okay. Right, like I said, I'm quite hard with this. I'm not going light. I'm just trying to hit up the textures a little bit. And voila. That's my rust. You can always, again, just experiment with it, guys, girls. Just have fun with it, and yeah, feel free to post any of your guys' success, your trials, your errors, whatever. If you have any questions, again, always feel free to shoot me a message. I will try to answer you as soon as I can. But yeah, I hope that was helpful, and I'll post a photo of this on my Instagram maybe tonight. And see, but this is what we did. Zoom in a little bit. Alright. Oh boy, no, okay. Well, thanks for watching. Tell your friends. And I'll make sure I keep these videos coming. Alright. Have a good night.